Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock, host of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. For those new to the program, this podcast is focused on how parents should custom tailor their parenting style to fit what's best for their families, themselves, and most importantly, their kids. Today, I'm going to be talking to my friend Carrie Sheffield. Carrie is a senior policy analyst at IWF. She's had a long career in DC as a reporter and broadcaster and commentator on all sorts of TV stations. She's earned a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University and was a Fulbright scholar in Berlin. She began her work in the investment and finance sector and then began a career in policy in Washington, first at the American Enterprise Institute, and she's been at several other think tanks around DC, eventually coming to IWF and working with me there. I love working with Carrie. Carrie has received dozens of awards for her policy and media work, much deserved. Really glad to have you on, Carrie.
Julie, thanks for having me. And I love working with you too.
And we worked even before you came to IWF. We worked. You used to interview me on your talk shows. That was always fun, and I'm thrilled that you're with IWF now. I was when I was preparing this, I was going through your bio, and I have to say your bio is enormously impressive. But and I think sometimes when I read these bios, I think, what are people thinking? And I think a lot of people might hear that bio and say, boy, she must have had a ton of connections before she came to DC. Or, and I feel like this happens quite often in DC, she might be from some wealthy family that was well connected to have landed where she did. And again, you have this incredibly impressive bio, but in reality, you are an incredible policy analyst, but also have a lot of media experience. But that's really not the case with you, is it? In terms of being from some big family with connections to get you started in Washington. That wasn't how it happened, right?
Well, I am from a big family with 7 siblings, but not from a family that was connected in Washington, and certainly have really worked my butt off for everything that I've gotten in life. And I've made a lot of mistakes that I deeply regret. But there's an author who she says, my mistakes were legendary, but God's grace was even more legendary. And that's how I feel. I've made a lot of mistakes that I regret, but having, leaned on my faith, that's how I've gone through them all, in addition to the trauma that I had as a kid.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit. You had an unusual childhood, and some people would say, quite challenging. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, how you grew up, and some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, so I just signed with a book where I'm going to be telling the full backstory. I want to respect the privacy of my siblings, so I'm there, making sure that the story is really focused on the struggles that I went through while being empathetic. So it's sort of, this dance that I want to be respectful and talking with my siblings about it. But
Yeah.
We were raised in a very abusive environment that I would describe as a cult environment. Where my father believes that he's a prophet, and in order to satisfy the prophetic call in his life, he basically, and he was doing it before he got married and had the 8 kids, that he lived the life of an itinerant street musician. And he has an incredible resume of a classical guitarist. He was self-taught. And if any of your listeners know about Andre Segovia, he was probably the world's most talented classical guitarist that we know. And he hand-selected my father to be one of his masterclass students and mentored him with his guitar music compositions.
Wow.
My father won the National Young Composers Contest. And this was all just through his own. He ended up being a professor of guitar at Brigham Young University. But he gave that all up, he said, because God called him to be a street preacher. And so he would play his guitar on the streets with a little amplifier, and then people would come and he would pass out Mormon brochures to try to convert them to Mormonism. And then eventually, as we grew older, he made us all do it with him. So we had the whole family, 10 people, playing on street corners. And we lived in a motorhome. So the name of the book is called The Motorhome Prophecies. And it was a very stressful and traumatic environment, to the point where 2 of my brothers developed schizophrenia, even though they had no signs of it when they were younger. And it's an ongoing debate. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but everything I've read about schizophrenia and being close to two people who have it, it's usually a combination of nature and nurture, that you could have chemical imbalance tendencies, which we do have on my dad's side. But certainly the nurture, or the lack of nurture in our case, I have no doubt contributed to their schizophrenia. And one of them tried to sexually assault me when or he tried to rape me. He sexually assaulted me, or he groped me when I was a teenager. And that was really a catalyst to me to say, okay, like, do I believe my dad's a prophet? Because when you grow up believing your dad, like, I believed he was a prophet for a long time. But then as I got older, I started to see how things he would say would not square up with what the LDS church would say. And I want to be careful and clear to say that what our family did was cultish, but the Mormon church is not a cult. I don't believe that. And some Mormons hear me say that, and they're like, "Oh, you're saying Mormonism is a cult?" I'm like, "No, it's not." In fact, my parents were excommunicated from the Mormon church, the official LDS church, for being so extreme.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm sad. I think they should have been excommunicated years earlier, but they were excommunicated after I was an adult. But because he was so good at running away, basically, the justice didn't catch up with him. I ended up going to 17 public schools and homeschool.
Carrie, let me stop you one sec, because I wanted to talk to you about being a young child. You have a number of brothers and sisters. Were there other family members involved that could have helped and didn't? I'm just curious about, you're in this situation where you're clearly in an unstable family environment. I think a lot of people wonder at these moments, where was social services? And honestly, Carrie, I've had guests on this show, and certainly at IWF, we talk a lot about the problems with foster care system. But were there any attempts of state intervention in your family situation? I know that you've talked about also sometimes being on government assistance, which is, something I think on the right, we tend to be like, oh, but there are families who actually really do need to bridge the gap between, maybe when they have a job and when they don't have a job. So talk to me a little bit about that growing up, and what the role was, and if anyone tried to help. Anyway, I'm going on, but you get my question here.
Yeah, no, and it's something that I've thought a lot about just over the years. So yes, when I was pre-K, so it was before my kindergarten. I was either 4 or 5, around that age. We were living somewhere in suburban Massachusetts. The town was called Marlborough, like small working class town. And I distinctly remember the social services trying to take us away. And they showed up, and my dad like really coached us beforehand to say, like, I'm great. Like, tell them how happy you are and how great I am. And I was very loyal to him, and we all were, because he was our dad. It's like you circle the wagons, and you feel threatened. And so I do remember they took us to their offices, and those little wiry bead mazes that they're on a little platform, and I love those things, and they had one there, but I remember being like, I'm not going to do it. It's like a temptation, and they're trying to take me away, and they hate my dad, so I'm not going to touch it. I want to. But we either convinced them enough to not take us away immediately, or we disappeared. We went to Utah, and so they never took us away from there. I do remember also that apparently so I have 4 older brothers. I'm the first girl. And I guess some of my brothers had told them about how he told us later, our father, that, we were too poor to have a television. So I would entertain my kids by telling them stories of my street fights. And so my brothers told the social services about his street fights, and they're like, oh my gosh, he's a violent guy. He's getting into all these brawls. Because when he would play his music on the street corners, he would have, fellow buskers or bums or like homeless people, like they were, they didn't like him sometimes. And so he would get in these fist fights, and sometimes he landed in jail. And he said, so he had all these wild stories, and I'm sure he embellished them, but and they were entertaining. Like my dad's an entertaining guy. And the thing is, like, his father was a politician in Utah, actually. So he came from actually a very strong family. My dad's sister was Miss United States, Miss USA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was Miss Utah USA, and then Miss USA Funny story. She was actually the first runner-up, but then the winner, it was determined it was a fraud because she was married and had 2 kids. So yeah, my aunt lost her crowning moment, but she got it later.
Wow.
She got the crown shipped to her. But yeah, so he came from a good family, um, and his father was a really savvy. They didn't have money growing up, but his father was a savvy real estate investor. Like he bought out some land in Utah that appreciated like exponentially. So by the time we were adults, it was worth a lot of money. But they never saw it growing up, and I never saw it until I was 23, and I got some inheritance. I mean, not a huge amount, but it was like, but I had no idea what to do with it, and I ended up giving it to my uncle who like destroyed the investment, and I was like, what's wrong with like I have yeah. So but so and he had siblings and my mom, and they all were really set. Like, so on my mom's side, they it's all sisters, so very strong women, and they were all really sad because my mom growing up was always kind of shy, and I think my dad really exploited that to really just
Sure.
charm her. He's a very charismatic guy, when he wants to be, at least for the short term, but and just took her away. And that's one of the classic abuser tactics, is to take an abusive woman away from her family and to brainwash her. And
Yeah.
they brainwashed her to the point where she would not tell her family where she was. So so they were left with this choice: do we call the cops on our own sibling and risk an escalation of maybe he gets violent or maybe he does something to the kids?
Yeah.
And then half the time they didn't know where we were, because we were in motorhomes and mobile homes and tents. Like, my mom gave birth in a tent, like, which is just insane to me.
Yeah.
And but she hated her family. Like, she believed that she didn't go to her own mother's funeral because she said her mother was a slut, because she had had a child out of wedlock before she got married, and so she refused to go to her funeral. And so that was part of it, where it was like a Stockholm syndrome, or just
Sure.
willing obfuscation of where we were. And then on my dad's side, I just found out more recently that some of his siblings were trying to do things to take us away. And they tried some different things and it didn't work. And the way they ended up just trying to make it better was that they ended up just taking some of my grandpa's inheritance and giving it to him, so that we didn't starve and we didn't have to go on welfare anymore. And to me, it's kind of like giving money to Iran, where they use the money to suppress the people even more.
Right. Now, once your father received that money, was he able to improve your condition? Did things get better, or was it wasted?
Well, it was marginally better. So we didn't go on welfare as much. So we were on public welfare, but we more often were on Mormon welfare, which to LDS Church's credit, they have this amazing system of private charity, which I'm just giving a plug. Like, Utah has the top social mobility in the entire country. They have strong families, and they have this amazing private welfare program, and it's called the Bishop's Storehouse. So we ate from there all the time, and it's just like, it's like generic Mormon brand, anything. Like, usually we are most commonly got like cereal or pasta. And I do remember we had like this cracked wheat that had weevils in it, which was disgusting, because like it's in this storehouse, and it was like we eat it, and then we like in the milk.
And your mom is screaming, "It's extra protein, just eat it," right?
Well, and that's now come in vogue, I guess, to eat bugs.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you are very in vogue. But this is the thing. I think a lot of people, I I think we're in a situation right now in the United States where kids are going to be recovering from sort of the COVID shenanigans for a lot of years. Certainly not the same. I'm not saying that necessarily these children were, abused or starving, but there has been this sort of upheaval in what we would consider a normal childhood and sort of the normal trajectory of education and that kind of stuff. It strikes me as you could provide some good information to even kids going through this. Not that kids are necessarily listening to this podcast, but you certainly went through a tough time in your childhood, and yet obviously have recovered. And I don't know your relationship necessarily with your family, but you have a great life. How how do you how as a child do you come out? I mean, when you went to college, and I see that you got your master's degree at Harvard, you were a Fulbright fellow, in Berlin. I mean, how does one, while living in these conditions, probably in high school, I mean, you lived with your family all up until you left for school, correct? I do know that. So, I mean, what happened, when it was time to leave or when you were thinking about college? Did you have the support of your family? And, and if not, like, how does a child actually self-propel like that?
Yeah, well, I haven't read the book Educated by Tara Westover, but I've met her, and um, our stories are very similar. I don't know all the details of how she did it, but her story has been on, and I have no deluded grandeur that I'll sell even a fraction of the number of books. She sold 8 million books. And Barack Obama endorsed her book on his reading list, and Michelle Obama did as well. But it's a story of growing up in a Mormon abusive environment in Idaho, and she didn't set foot into a classroom until she was, I think, her senior year. But she and her brother got their hands on some standardized testing prep books, and she put herself through BYU and got a full scholarship to Cambridge for a PhD.
Mm,
And when I took my standardized testing, I was able to get some software and use it on a very ancient computer and be able to. And the first time I took the standardized testing, I was like, wow, I'm actually, because they were like, they put like the average score
mm,
where someone in your range went to. And I was like, wow, like I could maybe go to Johns Hopkins, or I could like I'm actually pretty smart,
oh,
even though I had been told that I was an evil slut my whole life.
oh, Carrie. So I want to, so okay,
But
so you take this test
yeah,
and
so I
you
took the
see,
test, and at the time I was going to homeschool, and when I took the ACT, we were living in a shed in the Ozarks of Missouri because my dad had this dream to have a theater in Branson, Missouri, because there are a lot of Mormon families down there, like the
sure,
Osmonds and the Duttons and um, the Hughes family and the Brett family. So we tried to get a theater down there, but because my dad's so mentally ill that it was a total failure and a waste of everything, and we were living in a shed. And I was like,
oh,
and then my brother had tried to rape me, and I was just like, I don't want this life for myself. And also the other catalyst was my brother trying to rape me. And then at that point, I was like, I'd have to decide if I like believe he's a prophet or not. Because my 4 older brothers were still living at home.
yeah,
They still believed he was a prophet. Well, one of them had schizophrenia, but he still was part of the mission, he called it. Um, and I was like, I don't know if I believe this mission anymore. So what I did was actually an investigative journalism project, kind of my first. I decided to investigate my father and whether I believed he was a prophet. And so
mm,
what I did was, he at the time was actually, for many years, his whole life, he's talked about wanting to write his autobiography. And so he had a few boxes of papers and things and letters that were stored in a fiberglass trailer attached to the back of our motorhome. And so I said, at that point, I'd been writing for the local newspaper, in which they had a weekly column. I didn't do it every week, but they let every week a young person write in. It was called Young Voices. It's actually the same newspaper where Brad Pitt's mom wrote an op-ed
oh,
that went
yeah,
viral. So because he went to my rival high school where I ended up graduating down in the Ozarks, but years ahead of me, I never met him. But so I was like, I like writing, like maybe I can help you. And so I sorted through his boxes to really just understand who he was. And I was typing them up into this really ancient word processor, very basic, to put it all in ink for him. And as I was sorting through it, it became very clear to me that his family was very disturbed by him. There were letters from his mom, and it was back in the day when they had carbon copies of letters. So he
yeah,
letter, and so he had his copy, and his letters just grew. So some of them were when he was a Mormon missionary over in England, like an official LDS, name tag in London, and he just got so preachy to his parents and telling them how sinful they were and all these things. And his mom would write these very concerned letters to him, and he was just getting radicalized. And I just was like, wow, I love my grandma. Like I was really, upset by that. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, in the moment where I was like, he's not a prophet, I found some handwritten revelations that he had written down. And they were written in Elizabethan English, like King James Version Bible English, which is what the LDS Church
Wow. Yeah.
is, King James. And they were written, so the LDS Church has 4 books of scripture. They have the Bible, they have the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. So they have 4 basically Bibles, including the Bible.
Sure.
And Doctrine and Covenants is what they believe is kind of like Muhammad, where he wrote down revelations from God or from the angel. And the Doctrine and Covenants is Joseph Smith's handwritten revelations from God that were about how to run the church. And these handwritten revelations that I found written in Elizabeth English were to my dad, and they were from God, and they were using his God name, which was Daniel Strong, which he had told us before that was his God name, was named Daniel Strong. And my mom was Joan Strong. And I was like, so it was like, and thus the Lord said to my servant Daniel, thou shalt take thy wife, thy will be, thou family will face persecution, and all, like, it was like,
Yeah.
his own version of the Doctrine and Covenants. And my hand started to shake, and I was just like, he's a false prophet, because I was still very devout LDS, and I was like, he's trying to be, because in LDS church there's only one prophet, and he lives in Salt Lake, and I was like, he's trying to do his own thing, he's a rogue prophet. So I was like, I don't believe this. And I knelt down, and it was winter, and there was this little heater that I had going to keep me warm, and I knelt down, and I was like, God, I don't believe he's a prophet, and if you want me to stay, please show me, otherwise I'm gonna leave. I just left that there, and God never showed me anything to keep me. And so I told my dad I wanted to leave, and what he did was he raised his hand in the square, and he prophesied, and he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, if you're raped and murdered, that if you leave, you will be raped and murdered.
Good grief.
Yeah. So I was disowned. And so
how old were you at this point?
I was 18, and I was 17 or 18, right around that time. And so I was like, well, either my brother's going to rape me, or if I leave, like, I'm going to be raped. And so I had a decision to make, and I chose freedom. So I guess to answer your question, as far as like advice I would give to people, because, when I left, I was disowned. In some ways it was a good quarantine, because he wouldn't allow me to come home, because he's like, you're full of Satan. I was the first to leave. And he's like, you're going to corrupt your siblings. You can't come home. So I was disowned all through college, which, like I said, in some respects was good, because it kept me away from that insanity. But I also felt this deep rejection and sorrow, because, my mom also had she prophesied I would get schizophrenia. So there's all these false prophecies spoken over my life. And then my dad also told me later on, when I was in college, that God told him I had an abortion. And I was like, I don't know how that's possible, because I was a virgin. And I was like, there's no such thing as an abortion. So no, I didn't have an abortion. And I was like, so, okay, yeah, if I ever thought he was a prophet, and now he's telling me this thing, which is a biological, not reality, like, I know he's not a prophet. So I think that there is a room for therapy, like a good therapist. If you're a believer, get a believer therapist. And the way I got through all of it, I like to say, is a combination of prayer and therapy. And along the way, I have made a lot of self-sabotaging mistakes. I've been diagnosed with PTSD, depression. I had severe anxiety, to the point where I was hospitalized 7 times. And I had fibromyalgia, which is a whole other thing about how I feel about Western medicine. It's been totally divorced from body and mind and spirit, and they try to pump you full of drugs. And 2 of my hospitalizations were from drug reactions that they gave me to drugs, because they had no idea what the hell they were doing. And this was pre-COVID. So when COVID hit, I kind of felt this Schadenfreude of like, you all are horrible people, and you almost feel like you kind of deserve this. Which
that's a whole nother podcast, Carrie.
Yeah,
but I do, this is the one thing that I think is interesting, and maybe we can conclude by talking about, you did turn yourself away, not just from the Mormon church, but in general, God. You said you had become agnostic at one point. And I think we do need to have you back on, because I do want to talk about this a little bit further. But one of the things, and I bet this would be part of your, I'm not you, I don't mean to speak for you, but I bet part of your advice to people would be, not turn your back on God. In fact, to figure out ways to strengthen your relationship with God. And tell us a little bit about that journey. I know that's terrible to say. And quickly tell us about your entire faith journey. But I do think there was a point, and I think that everyone could, after dealing with that sort of childhood, which was definitely wrapped up in religion, obviously, um, turning your back away and becoming agnostic. But what made you turn back to the church, and not necessarily the Mormon church, to sort of give us a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, well, I think my biggest takeaway is first understanding the very big difference between religion and relationship. Like God is not religion. And I think that we're at this moment in our society where young people especially are turning away from institutions, be it faith. I mean, trust across the board in our institutions is crumbling, whether it's government or schools or medicine, and faith is a big one where we're also seeing the decline in trust. And for me, as someone who was deeply abused by very religious people, yes, I walked away from faith. I was agnostic for almost 12 years. And because the way I thought about it was, if God exists, he's probably a jerk because he allowed this to happen to me, or he's just indifferent, or he's someone who is proactively like trying to like hurt people, because people who use his name to do horrible things, they give God a bad name. And I like to say it's sort of like a knockoff purse with a Gucci with a big G on it. That's a knockoff. That's not God. And it took me a long time. And I'm writing a whole book about the journey of how it happened, but it was a combination of really surrendering and being through, and I know this is going to sound really funny, Julie, but there's a great book that I recommend called Counterfeit Gods by a pastor named Tim Keller, who's fantastic. He has cancer right now. He's older, but he had a really long career in New York City building a church called Redeemer, but he's a very well-known author. People compare him as like the modern day C.S. Lewis. Tim Keller's book is all about each chapter is a false idol that we pursue, that we put as a counterfeit God, be it career, sex, power, money. And it's like, I pretty much tried all of those, and they kept failing. I tried my career, and then I got laid off from a company, tried dating relationships, getting married. And I was in just a really bad engagement situation, and I broke it off, was heartbroken. And it was just, and then finally I thought I had settled on a God that wouldn't fail me. And that was the God of politics and public policy. And I went to the Harvard Kennedy School, which is named after JFK. And I think in some ways I had kind of put Kennedy as sort of like a Messiah type figure for me, kind of like Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King. And to me, that was my religion. That was my higher calling, my higher purpose in life. And I think a lot of especially secular liberal young people have this too. I was a secular conservative. That's what I called myself. And I had done that in the same way that a lot of progressives do. It's less common for conservatives to do it, but I was certainly one of those people. And then, so this is the funny part. Then Donald Trump happened. And I was like, I can't worship that. No, I had an existential crisis. I was a never Trumper till the end. Like, I didn't vote for Hillary either. Of course, there was no way in hell I'd vote for Hillary. But I wrote in Ben Sasse as my protest candidate in New York, which I deeply regret now.
Carrie, I'm gonna make fun of you for that, but go on. Okay.
Yeah, but so it was this existential moment. So I actually have Donald Trump to thank for turning me to faith, in the sense that because I was sitting on the sidelines and I had built my whole career toward, working on a campaign or working in the White House, like that was the pinnacle of what would have been success for me. And then to be like, I can't get on board with this guy. Like, he says these things about women. He donated to Hillary. He has no track record. Like, to me, there wasn't any daylight between him and Hillary. I didn't have faith that he would do what he said he was going to do. And then he'd done all these terrible things. So I was just like, I need something else in my life to fill this void of purpose and meaning, since the Republican Party is not going to do it for me. And so that's when I started to go to church, and I started to go to Tim Keller's church in New York. And then I kept showing up for God, and God kept showing up for me. So each week I either went to church or I went to small group. And that's how it started.
Well, and I think that a lot of people, young people, go through that, and that doesn't necessarily take a terrible childhood. You can have a pretty great childhood and still, in your early adulthood turn away. But I do think that as people get older, they need that, not only structure, but they need to believe in something bigger. Yeah, Carrie, I think, you've talked a lot about, I've read some of your writing on the subject of family and your hopes to someday have a family, and get married and settle down and have kids. If you were to pick a parenting style, or maybe you're like me and you just sort of do this patchwork quilt of different styles that sort of fit your family. But is there someone in the parenting realm, or someone you admire or you look to or you think or someone who, like you, recovered from a very difficult childhood and is trying to figure things out as she raises her whole own family? Is there someone you sort of admire and maybe would employ in your style of parenting if that day comes?
Well, I have to admit I haven't read parenting books really. I do like Emily Oster.
Yes, of
She
course.
seems like she makes a lot of sense and is very logical. And two of my brothers are married and they each have two kids, and they don't want to pass on generational
Of
curses.
course.
And so I guess I have to be mindful of not being reactive of like, okay, I know what I don't want as a parent. When I had my startup that used to come on Bold TV, they weren't my children, but I mentored and had a lot of really young college students and young people on staff. So I felt like in some respects it was sort of like, and I'm not saying that
Of
career is,
course.
but I just had a taste of like,
Yeah.
yeah, really, patience. I want to be a patient parent. And I definitely, I think explaining to kids the importance of faith and being with faithful people in church, to me, that's very important. But understanding that your own relationship with God is far more important, but it's not about control. And I think God is not about controlling us. He gave us free will. And as a parent, that's what I want to. I want to give my kids free will, but I also want to know to know that there are rules, and I think
Yeah.
that's the problem when I see parents go way too far on the other spectrum. There's a phrase that I think is really interesting, and I think it might apply to parenthood, which is that you cannot break God's commandments, you can only break yourself on them.
Mm.
And I think that good parenting is teaching your kids, good principles and good rules, but letting them make some mistakes. I think that that's part of why I made so many mistakes later on, was because I wasn't allowed to make mistakes when I was a kid.
Mm.
It was just such a sheltering and abusive and traumatizing environment that I really didn't have those normal high school experiences of like, oh, this boy, this and this. It was like I'm in a motorhome and I have to figure out how to like not be frozen this summer and like get my homeschool done in the mail. Like there's,
Yeah.
so I made some, I was like a feral cat when I left
Mm.
home.
Yeah.
uh,
Yes.
so, so I think those are some big ideas of how I would think about parenting.
Well, Carrie, I think you had, I don't, I always feel bad saying this, but you reveal pretty much here you had a tough childhood and you really have created a life of meaning, of doing great works, and I admire you a lot for sort of coming out of that. And I know you still have good relationship with your siblings and your nieces and nephews, and that is also a wonderful thing to see. You've got a really encouraging story. Tell us about your latest book, or your new book. I'm sorry, your new book coming out. Not it has not. I don't know if it has a title yet, but you just reveal what you can here.
Yeah. Title is called Motorhome Prophecies. And it's the manuscript's due January 2nd. And so my guess is it'll be, I mean, we'll see. I'm learning this new publishing world. I'm hoping possibly next summer for it to come out. And the publisher is Hachette, which is a publisher out of Paris and New York. And I have a fantastic agent who helped me arrange it. He's Jonathan Braninsky with Athos. And I think a big message I want to leave with people, again, is that even if you were from a traumatized background, you don't have to pass that trauma on to the next generation. And that's like, and even more societally, when there's all this talk about CRT and, intersectionality and all this heteronormative assaults, like I wasn't that far left, but I was also really angry at Judeo-Christian systems for a long time. And I think that part of my journey was to understand the healthy parts of, that's actually a human made thing. It's not from God. And we need to develop those relationships with God. And also, my father was sexually abused by a babysitter, and I know that traumatized him, and I know that he passed that on to us. And but we can break that cycle. And I think that's the difference from believing in systemic, uh, you know, destruction of your life, that your identity is based in systemic oppression, is so counter to the idea that the individual and the connection with God, that's empowering. That's, you are not, a, you're not going to be crushed by the system. And I am a testament to the fact that even though I was in a horrible system growing up, I've been able to thrive because I focused on healing myself, because I didn't put my identity as an abused person at the forefront of my mind. And I think that that's what's happening to society today, is that people, they think I'm abused, I'm abused, I'm abused. I'm Black, therefore I'm abused. I'm a girl, therefore I'm abused. If that's how you go through your whole life, then you will remain there. And so you have to reject that. You have to view yourself as an individual, not as someone who is solely trapped in a specific role.
Well, Carrie, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me and talking about this. I feel like this very small conversation we've had is going to launch 1,000 podcasts, or 1,000 episodes, because there's so much more I want to explore with you. So I hope you'll come back and we can tackle some of these other issues. But thank you so much for sharing your story today.
Thank you, Julie.